The call didn't come from dispatch. It didn't come from a family member or a neighbor or a patrol unit doing a welfare check. It came from a medical resident, young, unranked, nervous, who flagged something in a triage report that didn't match what the patient's chart claimed. The woman on the gurney, he said, had been admitted for a chemical burn to the eyes, reportedly from oven cleaner. But the severity of the damage, the saturation pattern, and the lack of external splatter suggested something else, something intentional. Heather Cornelius arrived at Richmond General just after 6 a.m. on November 18, 2022. The man who brought her in stayed long enough to fill out a name on the admittance form, refused further questions, and left before anyone could verify his identity. She didn't speak. Couldn't, maybe. Her pupils were fixed. Her optic nerves were fried. The attending ER physician noted chemical exposure consistent with a highly corrosive alkaline agent, not common household oven spray. In the first 2 hours, Heather was unresponsive to light stimuli, and her eyelids were already beginning to swell shut. The burns were bilateral and symmetrical. That mattered. Accidents aren't symmetrical. Accidents don't leave residue in clean semicircles across the cornea with no burn trails along the cheeks, forehead, or chin. Accidents don't involve nitrile gloves left behind in the patient's handbag. By 7:50 a.m., the hospital's forensics liaison was on the phone with the Richmond Police Department. When Officer Diane Lowry arrived at the ER's secure intake bay, she didn't have much to work with. No crime scene, no complaint, no cooperative witness. But the hospital flagged Heather as suspicious trauma, possible domestic violence, which under Virginia statute triggered mandatory documentation and preservation protocol. Heather was conscious but disoriented. She answered to her name. She could nod and with difficulty whisper. But she wasn't asking questions. Not about where she was, not about her kids, not even about her eyes. Nurses reported that she resisted touch, particularly from male staff. When one of them asked if someone had hurt her, she said, "No," flatly. Then she flinched when he touched her arm to adjust her IV. The attending toxicologist made the first clinical note that would shift the tone of the case. Burn depth and pattern consistent with directed exposure. Agent appears to be industrial-grade sodium hydroxide or similar. Unlikely source, household oven cleaner. Recommend preservation of clothing, personal effects. Her shirt had already been cut away by paramedics. What remained, denim jeans, socks, undergarments, were bagged by Officer Lowry with chain of custody tags and transferred to evidence. Nothing about the clothing suggested chaos. No tearing, no residue outside the neckline or sleeves. Her injuries had occurred with precision. There was no sign of defensive wounds. At 10:13 a.m., Heather was transferred to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center due to her status as an active duty member of the United States Coast Guard. That's when NCIS and the Coast Guard Investigative Service, CGIS, were formally looped in. The incident had crossed jurisdictional thresholds from civil domestic dispute to federal military case file. Lowry's preliminary report summarized the knowns. Victim Heather Cornelius, 34, active duty, rank BM2, boatswain's mate 2nd class. Condition, acute bilateral chemical ocular burns. Vision loss, complete. Narrative, alleged exposure via oven cleaner accident. Inconsistencies noted. Possible trigger factors, unknown. No witness testimony, no 911 call on record. Next of kin notified but not present. 2 minor children noted in medical file. Still, no formal suspect. No warrant. No search order. Yet. What pushed the case forward wasn't Heather's testimony. It was a piece of plastic, sealed in a Ziploc bag, recovered from the lining of the handbag she'd arrived with. Inside was a latex glove, stained slightly along the fingertips with a translucent residue. Preliminary strip tests showed an alkaline pH between 13 and 14, and the glove was sized for a man's hand. One of the medical residents wrote in her notes, "She doesn't speak unless asked. Even then, she waits. It's like she's rehearsing what's safe to say." That single sentence made its way up the report chain by noon. By that evening, 2 case folders had been opened, one under Richmond PD's Domestic Violence Unit, the other under Federal Military Investigative Command. Both with the same patient, both with the same question: how does a woman get her eyes chemically burned and end up in a hospital with no call for help, no scene to examine, and no witness except the one who walked away before anyone could get his name? The Coast Guard does not easily miss one of its own, especially not a boatswain's mate 2nd class who had never failed to report for duty, never missed a muster, never triggered internal concern. But when Heather Cornelius was absent on November 18th, her superior officer didn't assume illness or indifference. He filed a formal non-attendance report within the hour, citing unusual behavior for this member, and flagged it up the chain. Within 24 hours of her hospitalization, CGIS initiated a background review, standard protocol in cases where a service member is injured under suspicious, potentially criminal circumstances. What they uncovered didn't align with the surface narrative of a clean, stable professional. Heather had served for over a decade. Her service record was without disciplinary action. Peer reviews described her as precise, disciplined, and difficult to distract once she locked into task. She had completed rescue operations, maintenance commands, and routine port duties without hesitation. Her leadership skills were noted, so was her privacy. It was that privacy that first raised flags when investigators pulled her digital records. There were gaps, not in performance, but in communication. Heather had dramatically reduced her off-base interactions over the prior 6 months. There were no active personal social media accounts. Her text activity dropped by 83% in the last quarter. Her call logs showed a repetitive pattern: 2 outgoing numbers, both local, alternating, restricted to late-night windows. One belonged to her mother. The other was a prepaid cell registered under a non-identifiable name. And then there was the withdrawal form. 6 weeks prior, Heather had submitted a leave of absence request, personal family-related matters, to be effective mid-October. The request had been approved, but then rescinded. No explanation. When asked by her commanding officer why she changed her mind, she reportedly responded, "It's handled now." Investigators pulled her base entry logs. Her daily arrival times had shifted, from consistent early check-ins to irregular late appearances. Her ID badge was scanned less frequently. Security footage at Gate 3 showed her entering alone but frequently checking her rearview mirror. On October 22nd, she was seen removing her base decal from her windshield, a breach of standard visibility protocol. She'd also recently opted out of base housing and relocated to a small off-base unit, address confirmed through a housing stipend application submitted September 10th. That's when they found her Coast Guard-issued secure locker had been emptied. Only her nameplate remained. These aren't direct indicators of threat or abuse, but they are indicators of someone systematically stepping out of sight. Investigators contacted her base roommate from the previous assignment, BM1, Angela Reed, who confirmed Heather had become noticeably withdrawn in the last year. Not depressed, not anxious, controlled. She started checking in with someone every time she wanted to leave the room, Reed told CGIS. Like she needed permission, or someone needed to know where she was going. That wasn't like her. Heather didn't ask. Her fitness test results remained consistent, but she stopped participating in unit-level socials. She declined offers to carpool, and when asked once if she wanted to grab dinner, she reportedly replied, "Not unless he says it's okay." No one knew who he was. Back in Richmond, the forensics team cataloging Heather's personal effects from the hospital located a sealed white envelope tucked into the side zipper of her gym bag. It contained a folded legal-size paper, unsigned and undated, but the header was clear: custody modification request, draft only, not yet filed. It named 2 minor children. It listed Heather as the sole petitioner. There was a section describing concerns for safety, left blank. But in the margins, in handwriting matching her service records, were 4 words: delete if threatened again. The paper had no creases. It had not been handled frequently, but it was printed recently. A timestamp in the footer revealed the document was generated 5 days before the incident. NCIS requested internal personnel records on anyone Heather had identified as emergency contacts or cohabitants within the last 24 months. Only one consistent name appeared on both: spouse, same address, same phone number, same emergency designation, unchanged for over 7 years. But there had been no reported domestic incidents, no protective orders, no visible external injuries in the last 3 Coast Guard medical evaluations, which made what happened even more difficult to trace. This wasn't reactive violence. This had been built, slowly, quietly, and with tactical control. When CGIS officers conducted a preliminary review of her military-issued email, they noted an anomaly. Starting mid-August, all outgoing mail beyond the base firewall had a BCC line to a specific external address, an encrypted Proton-based inbox. There were no replies found in her account, but over 40 messages had been forwarded to that box. Most were blank emails with attachments, Scans of personal documents, family photos, logs of calls, screenshots of text messages, a pattern of documentation. It's what military personnel are trained to do: record, preserve, report through alternate channels if necessary. She was preparing something. She just hadn't finished it. One investigator noted, she operated like someone in an abusive hostage scenario, but inside her own home, under military regulation, and under everyone's radar. No one questioned her. She didn't give them a reason to, until she arrived at a hospital with industrial-grade chemical burns to both eyes. By the time the forensic toxicology unit received the initial swabs from Heather's eyes, clothing, and handbag, the medical diagnosis had already shifted from accidental chemical exposure to intentional application. The attending ophthalmologist noted the injuries were chemically precise. The burn radius was uniform across both corneas. No signs of spatter, no irregular trail markings down the cheeks or nose. It wasn't a spray, it was a pour. The compound was confirmed within 48 hours: sodium hydroxide, commonly known as lye. The pH testing on the glove tip found in her bag registered a level above 13.7. This was not the kind of material used for routine household cleaning. The specific compound belonged to a brand used in commercial degreasing and industrial drain clearing. The batch was manufactured in early 2022 and distributed to a limited number of retail outlets, primarily in Northern Virginia and parts of Maryland. The gloves had been purchased within the last 2 weeks. Evidence control located the receipt days later, crumpled inside a grocery bag, recovered from a trash bin at Heather's residence. It listed 3 items: nitrile gloves, heavy-duty drain opener, and a bottled water. The timestamp was 2 days before the attack. The store had exterior surveillance. Footage confirmed a male entering the store alone at 8:47 p.m., wearing a nondescript gray hoodie and a trucker cap. He paid in cash. His walk matched a gait observed in prior civilian footage submitted by neighbors. Narrow shoulders, forward lean, left foot slightly dragging. There was no mask, no attempt to obscure identity, but facial resolution was too poor to confirm legal identification without facial recognition, which required further warranting. Still, chain of purchase was now clear. The chemical didn't come from the home. It wasn't stored under the sink or in a shared cabinet. It was acquired deliberately, used deliberately, and administered with enough control that no burns appeared elsewhere on Heather's body. Intent was becoming hard to dispute. Investigators processed Heather's residence on November 20, 2022, under a sealed warrant for suspected aggravated assault. Entry was made with standard PPE after initial scans revealed potential chemical residue. The location was quiet, no forced entry, no sign of struggle. The bathroom was clean, too clean. Wipes had been flushed. Countertops were clear of personal items. One anomaly was immediately noted. The trash bin under the kitchen sink contained a used bottle of the same drain cleaner confirmed in the toxicology tests. The nozzle was wiped, but trace residue at the thread line matched the chemical compound recovered from Heather's corneal swab. More telling, in the laundry room adjacent to the kitchen, a pair of heavy-duty nitrile gloves were found drying on a rack. They had been recently rinsed but not laundered. Interior swabs indicated trace amounts of sodium hydroxide absorbed into the glove lining, not from handling the bottle, but from prolonged exposure during use. Even without blood, the scene was heavy with chemical signature. There was no physical altercation, no traditional forensic markers of violence, no hair pulled, no broken objects, just gloves, a bottle, a receipt, and one woman, blind. The timeline was reconstructed using digital forensics and home access logs. Heather's phone was geolocated to the residence from 9:12 p.m. to 4:06 a.m. No 911 calls originated from the property. Her phone data showed no movement, no app activity, no screen unlocks during that window. This was unusual for her. One incoming text, timestamped 9:44 p.m., read, "You didn't answer the door. Are you back?" The phone never responded. The internal security system, standard smart home equipment, was found disconnected. When reconnected, logs showed that remote access had been disabled the previous evening. No data was retrievable from the cloud due to firmware reset shortly afterward. Investigators documented all firmware logs. Last known reset, 8:26 p.m., November 17th. No coincidence. The bedroom showed no sign of distress, no sheets pulled, no drawers open. However, the couch in the living room had one anomaly, a faint circular patch on the center cushion that fluoresced under ALS, alternative light source. It wasn't blood, it wasn't sweat. It was consistent with a high-concentration alkaline solution. The cushion was removed, sealed, and submitted for further spectrographic analysis. Heather's body told a linear story. The burns indicated exposure while lying face up or at a reclined angle. No upward splash marks, no accidental angles. Her eyelids had been forced open. That was clear from the micro-abrasions along the inner folds. Abrasions consistent with forced exposure, not self-application or passive injury. The ophthalmology consultant submitted a forensic statement. This pattern cannot result from a chemical accident. The exposure was targeted, sustained, and applied in a manner designed to maximize irreversible ocular trauma. Defensive blinking or flinching would have produced partial sparing zones. No such sparing was observed. Put plainly, she had been held down or otherwise restrained. No fingerprints were recovered from the bottle. No DNA under Heather's fingernails. No witness accounts from neighbors. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was a controlled scene, executed quietly, leaving behind no biological trace of a struggle. But chemistry told its own story. Forensic crime scene analysts referred to it as non-reactive violence, a term for harm that isn't explosive, doesn't involve yelling or rage, but is methodical, clean, purpose-driven, the kind that rarely leaves behind broken furniture, but always leaves behind broken bodies. CGIS and Richmond PD agreed. The next phase of the investigation required digital device seizure and forensic imaging of all linked IPs, storage devices, and burner phone accounts tied to Heather's known contacts. If this was premeditated, and every data point now suggested it wasn't carried out without some form of planning trail. They wouldn't find a confession, but they didn't need one. They had chemistry, and chemistry doesn't lie. The first digital sweep began 72 hours after Heather's admission. CGIS obtained full access to her personal and work devices, including her issued cell phone, a personal laptop retrieved from her residence, and a secondary prepaid phone discovered in the back panel of her home office drawer. The contents of that drawer were neatly stacked: bank statements, a folded calendar with check marks, and a disposable SIM card in its original sleeve. Nothing was chaotic. Nothing appeared rushed. Forensic imaging began with the Coast Guard-issued phone. The data was clean, too clean. The phone hadn't been factory reset, but all outgoing communication over the previous 3 weeks had been deleted manually, including SMS, call logs, and application history. The only remaining records were from system functions, location pings, battery logs, and encrypted backups auto-synced to a military cloud server. The location data raised the first procedural flag. Heather's primary phone had registered movement within a 2-mile radius of her home address for most of the prior month. But between November 16th and 17, the device's GPS module stopped transmitting altogether for a 6-hour stretch. Power logs showed the device was still running. The module had not failed. Someone had placed the phone in airplane mode and disabled background location tracking. That window coincided with the suspected timeline of the assault. This wasn't accidental silence. It was control of digital trace. Attention shifted to the second device, the prepaid burner. The phone had limited storage and no cloud sync, but forensic extraction revealed a series of image files, all time-stamped within the last 60 days. None were traditional photographs. They were screen captures, text conversations, emails, calendar reminders, banking alerts, a photo of a USPS tracking receipt for a certified letter. All were saved under randomized alphanumeric file names, but metadata showed pattern. Each file had been exported within 5 minutes of receipt, suggesting someone was methodically archiving interactions in near real time. These weren't documents stored for nostalgia or convenience. They were evidence stockpiles. In one set, a screenshot of a banking transfer showed a $9,500 withdrawal from a joint checking account into a separate entity. Unknown recipient. No matching names in her emergency contact list. Another showed a draft of a message, never sent, stating, "If anything happens, check the black USB in the wall safe. Code is his badge number." CGIS traced the safe to the back of a wall-mounted bookshelf in her rented residence. They found the drive. It was real, and it was encrypted. The drive contained 86 files, PDFs, scanned documents, audio files, even dashcam clips saved from her vehicle's internal system. Much of it was redundant: bank records, receipts, custody inquiries, but several items carried more weight. One audio file, dated August 12, 2022, captured a phone call between Heather and an unidentified male voice. The voice was calm, deliberate, no yelling. The topic, child visitation. At one point, the man said, If you try to leave, you know what I'm capable of. You've seen it. Another file contained video footage of the rear of her property, captured from a motion sensor dash camera she'd mounted in her car window, facing the garage. In the early hours of October 2nd, a figure could be seen pacing near the side entrance. At 2:11 a.m., the figure approached the door, stood still for nearly 2 minutes, then left. No attempt to enter, no visible communication. The same figure appeared in a separate clip 3 nights later, this time carrying something in their left hand. CGIS analysts enhanced the frame and identified the object as a small cylindrical bottle, consistent in shape and proportion with the type of chemical container recovered from the scene. No alarm had been triggered. The camera's motion detection system was autonomous, with no network transmission. The footage was stored locally. Separately, Heather's Coast Guard email account revealed a set of recurring BCCs sent to an encrypted Proton mail address not associated with any known contacts. Forensic tracing identified the inbox as one registered anonymously, with access logged from 3 unique IP addresses across Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Alaska. The emails sent from Heather's base workstation included subject lines such as revised plan, in case file, and lockbox. None contained text. Each had attachments, images of call logs, screenshots of texts, and in one case, a full draft of her military exit paperwork, unsigned but pre-filled. The chain showed premeditation, not of violence, but of contingency. She had been preparing to leave, and she had known she couldn't leave cleanly. The last file CGIS reviewed was labeled JulyRecording.mp3. It lasted 14 seconds. Heather's voice, speaking low, direct. "This is for whoever finds this. I didn't fall. I didn't trip. If I end up hurt, it wasn't me. That's all you need to know." The recording had been saved under a name she never used elsewhere. In any other context, these files might have seemed excessive, defensive, even paranoid, but layered against the hospital report, the chemical findings, and the residence inspection, the files painted a picture not of fear, but of preparation. She hadn't expected to survive. By the 5th day, the case had moved from medical anomaly to targeted felony. With digital evidence pointing to calculated planning and suppressed data trails, the investigative priority shifted: build the chain. Purchase, possession, opportunity, and access. Each needed its own point of proof. The first concrete break came from a minor detail in the purchase history. The barcode on the chemical bottle retrieved from Heather's home matched a limited-run inventory sold at only 5 retail outlets statewide. One of those was a hardware chain in Prince William County. Transaction timestamp, 8:49 p.m., 2 days before the attack. CGIS requested security footage from that store's manager. It showed a man entering alone through the side entrance. He wore a gray zip-up hoodie and gloves, unusual considering it was 68 degrees that night. His face wasn't obscured, but he kept his head down throughout the visit. He spent less than 4 minutes inside. The camera above Register 2 confirmed the purchase: nitrile gloves, chemical drain opener, and a bottle of water. He paid in cash and exited without speaking to staff. Investigators later recovered the gloves at Heather's home, still damp, air-dried, laced with lye residue. The bottle, same batch number as the one on the receipt. It was a clean link: possession traced to purchase, purchase to intent, intent to action. Interviews with store employees added context. The man had visited once before, 2 weeks prior. Same aisle, same product section. That time, he left without buying anything. Store logs from that day were incomplete, but parking lot footage confirmed vehicle presence. A white SUV with no front plate. That vehicle type matched prior drive-bys captured on Heather's dashcam archives. Backtracking vehicle movement required DMV data and local traffic cams. Investigators focused on the 48-hour window surrounding the incident. A plate match wasn't immediate, but a private subdivision camera, one of several installed by HOA boards in suburban areas, captured the SUV turning into Heather Street at 3:18 a.m. on November 18th. It left just under 40 minutes later. Heather arrived at the hospital less than 2 hours after that. The suspect voluntarily submitted to an initial interview with local police under advisement. He provided a general timeline for that evening: home alone, asleep by midnight, no travel, no visitors. He denied ownership of the gloves, denied purchase of any chemical products, and claimed no knowledge of Heather's injuries beyond what he heard from her mother. But the phone data conflicted. Cell tower pings from his device aligned with the location of the hardware store during the precise time of purchase. More critically, The vehicle seen in the security footage was registered to his address, and the transaction, while made in cash, matched items discovered in his home. No forensic evidence connected him to Heather's body, no fingerprints, no DNA, no direct physical contact preserved. But every step of the sequence, from acquiring tools to arriving on site, was built on verifiable data. And it all converged on one person. The question wasn't whether the act had happened. It was whether each action was independent or if it was part of a constructed sequence. When investigators reviewed the prior 6 months of financial activity, they saw the same patterns repeat: cash withdrawals in exact intervals, visits to the same store on Wednesdays and Sundays, and internet searches for legal custody terminology from a shared IP address. It became clear. This wasn't a reaction, this was a process. The formal medical reconstruction began 6 days post-assault. Heather was stable, but her injuries remained classified as catastrophic. The ophthalmology team at Walter Reed submitted their final report to both CGIS and the Richmond District Attorney's Office. The summary was clear: full-thickness bilateral corneal burns, complete loss of visual acuity, irreversible damage to the optic nerves. She would never see again. The key forensic element wasn't the injury, it was the symmetry. Both eyes exhibited near-identical chemical exposure zones, with no evidence of defensive interruption. This ruled out splashing, accidents, or imprecise contact. The forensic ophthalmologist testified, "This pattern is consistent with direct application while eyelids were forcibly held open." The precision of the contact lines, combined with the concentration of sodium hydroxide in the ocular tissue, removed all ambiguity from the cause. What couldn't be said in blood or bruises, the tissue analysis confirmed. This wasn't the result of proximity to danger, it was the outcome of intent. At the same time, investigators processed the results of the glove interior swab collected from Heather's home. In addition to the chemical traces, 2 partial DNA samples were identified. One belonged to Heather, likely from incidental transfer. The other belonged to an unidentified male, later matched through CODIS as the primary suspect already under inquiry. There was no need for confession. The body, the object, and the timeline all aligned. Heather gave her first full statement 9 days after the attack. It was conducted with 2 officers present and recorded under sterile interview protocol. Her voice was calm, but controlled. The transcript showed no dramatization, no elaboration, just facts. She described being asked to come back to the house under the pretense of discussing visitation schedules. She was told the kids were asleep. When she arrived, the room was dimly lit, and she was asked to sit. She didn't question it. There was nothing overtly aggressive in tone or posture. She remembered being asked to close her eyes. She didn't remember what came next, only the burning and the sound of a bottle being set down on hard surface. When asked why she didn't run, she said she couldn't. She was paralyzed physically and mentally. It wasn't a scream and flee scenario. It was quick, targeted, and silent. Her testimony aligned with the forensic sequence: the clean application, the absence of struggle, the methodical pattern. It also aligned with the prior chapter's evidence trail: receipt, surveillance, vehicle data, and the backup files Heather had stored anticipating something like this might occur. The final assessment from the Coast Guard's forensic psychologist, provided independently, labeled the situation as calculated coercion leading to irreversible bodily harm. Not rage, not heat of the moment. Method, control, execution. In parallel, the DA's office began reviewing potential charges. At this point, the case profile had evolved: attempted murder, first degree, based on chemical weapon use; aggravated malicious wounding with evidence of premeditation; disabling a federal officer; Heather's active duty status triggered federal protections; use of caustic substance with intent to maim under Virginia Code Section 18.252.1. Federal prosecutors were consulted on dual jurisdiction. Since the victim was in service at the time, and the evidence spanned across state communication lines. For Heather, legal clarity didn't change her condition. Her recovery was physical only in the limited sense. She would require lifelong assistance for mobility, and her service career had ended. But her testimony triggered the formal arrest. The warrant was issued on November 27th. The arrest did not go smoothly. When law enforcement arrived at the suspect's temporary residence in rural Alaska, where he had relocated shortly after Heather's hospitalization, they were met with no resistance at the door. But within 20 minutes of contact, he was found deceased in a back storage shed, the result of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. There would be no trial. The postmortem confirmed timeline alignment with the incident. Personal devices in the residence contained digital footprints overlapping with Heather's email BCCs and the phone metadata already under investigation. No farewell message, no note of apology, just a case, closed administratively, but not resolved emotionally. There was no trial, no sentencing, no final cross-examination. With the suspect deceased before arrest, the case moved directly to closure under procedural terms, exceptionally cleared. For law enforcement, it meant the file would be marked solved. For everyone else involved, it meant unfinished work. The media coverage intensified once the details were released. Headlines focused on the method: chemical attack, permanent blindness, Coast Guard victim. Most outlets reported the death of the suspect as a conclusion. Internally, investigators disagreed. The crime was complete, but the context was still incomplete. CGIS and Richmond PD both conducted internal reviews. The goal wasn't to reassign blame, but to identify blind spots, missed reports, unfiled concerns, non-criminal precursors that might have signaled what was coming. Heather's service history was reanalyzed for overlooked indicators: her withdrawn behavior, declining communication patterns, changes in base housing. None of it had been flagged in real time. Military Victim Advocacy Services had only one formal contact from her prior to the assault, a query about parenting plans post-separation. It hadn't triggered a protective response. Heather had never filed a formal complaint. Her children were placed in temporary care during her recovery period, under observation from both Military Family Services and Child Protective Services. Custody was never contested. The biological father had no legal standing after the pending charges. But the psychological interviews conducted with the older child raised concern. During forensic interviews, the child repeated a consistent theme: the concept of rules changing, of mommy not allowed to leave at night, and dad saying not to tell. None of these qualified as abuse in isolation, but they painted a familiar pattern to professionals trained in post-traumatic interpretation. Those notes were sealed under juvenile protection statutes but used internally to support Heather's full reinstatement as guardian. The military's public response was subdued. A brief statement from the Coast Guard acknowledged the incident and confirmed the end of Heather's active duty status due to medical retirement. Internally, conversations began about updating early intervention mechanisms for identifying coercive control patterns, not just physical abuse, but isolation, dependency, and subtle behavioral shifts. Those changes would not be immediate. They would not retroactively apply to Heather's case. But the case was referenced explicitly during a joint military service review on domestic threat assessment protocols published in Q1 the following year. Her file was included as a teaching model. The legal question of whether the case should be tried in absentia for procedural record was debated, but ultimately dismissed. With no defendant, the charges could not be fully litigated. No restitution could be ordered. No sentencing could be served. However, the district attorney's office moved forward with a public summary filing. This included verified forensic evidence trail, statement of premeditation, full medical report on injuries sustained, witness depositions and supplemental interviews, final cause of death for the suspect, confirmed by Alaska State Medical Examiner. This filing allowed Heather to claim full victims' compensation, access federal disability under Title 38, and maintain her benefits through the Coast Guard Veterans Assistance Office. She spoke publicly for the first time at a closed seminar for law enforcement, recorded and later broadcast through domestic advocacy networks. Her words were measured: no appeal to sympathy, no dramatics. She spoke about documentation, how she learned to treat her life as evidence before anyone else believed it could turn criminal, about the importance of naming behaviors early, not waiting for bruises or fractures to justify action, and about the difference between surviving something and having it acknowledged by the institutions tasked with protection. The room stayed quiet. Officers took notes. Some looked at their own policies afterward. One internal memo from CGIS, circulated months later, summed up the case plainly. We cannot prevent every attack, but when a victim has documented threats, stored evidence, and still cannot access protection, that's a systems failure, not just an offender's crime. Heather's official discharge came 63 days after the assault. Medical retirement, full benefits, case closed. Her final act in uniform was signing a release of liability form, standard protocol for service members with career-ending injuries. But no form could account for what followed. She was transferred into a transitional housing unit operated by a military veterans support organization, outfitted with adaptive tools, digital voice assistants, tactile markers, orientation software. Most people assume blindness is silence. In practice, it's all information: audio, texture, routine, condensed, recalibrated, repatterned. She learned to read her environment in tones and temperature shifts. It wasn't healing, it was decoding. Physical therapy addressed posture and orientation. Occupational therapy focused on daily tasks, navigation, cooking, phone access. What couldn't be taught was the rewiring of instinct, trusting her steps, her own timing, her perimeter. That had been compromised before the injury. Now it had to be rebuilt without sight. She completed formal mobility certification in under 2 months, independent travel within 4. Her case manager noted her pace was faster than most. The file marked Heather Cornelius was archived into the CGIS case index under a restricted domestic violence subcategory. Internally, it was referenced in 2 agency-wide briefings on early detection training. A redacted version was adapted into training modules for recognizing non-physical patterns of control in service member households. It became a reference, but not a precedent. 3 months post-discharge, Heather joined a civilian-led research committee focused on institutional response to coercive behavior. Her input wasn't emotional, it was procedural. What records weren't shared? What flags didn't trigger alerts? What autonomy looks like before it disappears on paper? She declined interviews with major news outlets. She agreed only to closed-door panels for first responders, where she spoke less about violence and more about documentation. "Control is data," she once said. "You just need to know where it's stored." The residence where the assault occurred was sold within 6 months. No buyer requested details. The digital safe was removed. The room where it happened was repainted. No law required a record of what happened there. I've learned that danger doesn't always knock. It sometimes whispers, disguises itself in routine and silence in the absence of bruises. If you're watching this and something about my story feels familiar, don't wait for it to become an emergency. Document, speak, get out safely. Your instincts are not paranoia, they're data, and they might be the one thing that saves you. We talk a lot about justice, but sometimes survival itself is the win. What would you have done differently if you were in my place? Have you ever ignored a red flag because it didn't feel serious enough? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, or what moment in this story stood out to you. And hey, if this video resonated with you, or even if it didn't, let me know why. If you found this story powerful or meaningful, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing real stories that matter. See you in the next one.